Hello everyone and welcome back to Dragalia Foundry, a fan channel where everything Dragalia Lost can be found. This video is going to contain a side-by-side comparison of endgame content and combat in Dragalia Lost. I'll be showing on the left side of my screen my first ever clear of High Midgardsormr's trial all the way back from 2019, and on the right side of the screen a recent clear of Primal Midgardsormr's trial on the Master difficulty, recorded here in the final month of Dragalia Lost. I'm starting off by showing the character builds. I wanted to use the exact same team for each of these clears for comparison. However, just by looking at the builds, you can see a pretty drastic difference in how we outfit our characters then versus now. So the characters were not even fully built back in the day. Now we have things like shared skills, we have 7 wormprint slots instead of just 1, we have Primal Dragon and Agito weapons, which are much more powerful, we have access to brand new dragons. The second thing I want to point out, you could see briefly there the suggested might for the quest. There's obviously a big difference in that, but the second thing is the original clear on the left was a co-op clear, and nowadays there's both solo and co-op variants of all trials in the game, and so the one on the right is a solo clear. And as the game has gone on, solo has become a much more prevalent strategy compared to the original release of Dragalia Lost. The AI has gotten a lot better, our stats have gotten a lot better, strategies have emerged to make soloing possible and much easier to do, so that is one of the biggest differences between the left and the right. The other thing that I want to point out is just the sheer stats, both of the boss as well as of the characters. You can see that my basic attacks on the right are doing similar amounts of damage to my skills on the left. So there's a really big difference in the stats that we had access to then versus now. And in particular, in those endgame trials on the left, you had to meet a certain threshold of HP to even enter the fight, or you would be one-shot at the very beginning of the battle. Nowadays, it's a lot easier to potentially get carried through a trial, and some quests even have revives available that make it so even if you die, you can continue on and still get your rewards. So a lot has obviously changed. One thing that I think is also worth pointing out with this is just the fact that the meta changed a lot. So although I'm using the same team, on the right, my characters are affected by a debuff called Curse of Nihility. And that debuff makes it so that most of the commonly used buffs that were popular in the early days and the middle of Dragalia Lost life are negated. And so it required using different kinds of characters, different strategies to kind of work around that. I think that that's something that there's been a lot of iterations to, the kinds of wormprints, the kinds of builds and team comps that you'd want to use. I feel like overall it's pretty nice because we have seen a variety of characters be part of the so-called meta or be part of the so-called popular set of characters. So that's another thing I wanted to point out with this. One thing also that may not be obvious comparing the left to the right is that back in the day, you could not use rolls for iframes. Dodge rolling did not actually dodge, it just repositioned you. So there was no iframing benefit to it, there was no invulnerability associated with it. Obviously that is something that changed later in Dragalia Lost life, and at the time it was very controversial when that change happened, but I feel like it's for the best as some of the patterns you'll start to see on the right get very, very crazy here momentarily. So you're going to see some pretty crazy things on the right. On the left, honestly looks pretty simple and pretty straightforward, all things considered, and yet it's honestly so much more dangerous because those rolls are not necessarily providing safety. And to be fair, on the left in that original clear, I probably wasn't the same caliber of player that I was on the right. Even though there are things I'm doing on the right, I made a few mistakes, definitely got a lot better at the game as time went on, and definitely got more comfortable timing my skills, not holding them to be super conservative to save them for invulnerability frames, kind of actively using them, trying to get out good amounts of damage whenever possible. So I think that there's even a difference just over time in the skill of the player base. think that that's something that you really see with some of the harder endgame content that we have nowadays compared to the original release of High Midgardsormr's Trial, which was the only endgame content available at the time. Anyway, as far as the mechanics of these two fights, of course, they are a little bit different. One thing that I think is really cool, though, on the right with Primal Midgardsormr's Trial is all of these released characters, not only are they capable of clearing, but they all have pretty satisfying roles to play. I found this when I was doing solo, where I was able to switch between them at different moments. For example, Vanessa, who I'm controlling, she actually has knockback resistance in her kit now, and that makes it so that she's really good at some of those whirlwinds that have a suction effect. The other characters have their own properties as well that help them out a lot. So Mikoto, for example, has his Force Strike for mobility that can be good for dodging some of the attacks. But switching focus back on the left, even then, there was a role for each character to play. There were other characters that were used to clear High Midgardsormr's Trial at times. Obviously, that first clear I got was not a Deathless, so I ended up going back to get a Deathless and clearing it with Naveed. Naveed, Ezlith, and Sanoa being some of the other characters who could be used at the time, but had sleep res instead of stun res, which was a pretty big deal in the day, as if you were put to sleep, or rather if you were stunned, since they didn't have stun res, you couldn't move. Nowadays, in the right, Primal Midgardsormr's Trial, he could actually afflict you with sleep. So yeah, you have to be careful for both sleep and stun, I suppose. Although these characters I'm using all have stun res, so it was only sleep that was really a risk for me. As we finish the clear on the left of High Midgardsormr's Trial, I'll point out another difference is that the amount of time it took to do content increased pretty significantly. And I would say that's not only the length of the fights, but also the length of the grind that you would need to go through to get the weapons, to get the materials, to be invested enough to take on these fights in general. There were some quality of life updates made later on in Dragalia Lost Live to skip certain things and make farming easier via things like double drops, but especially around the release of the first time attacks and the introduction of the expert and master difficulty of the High Dragon Trials, the grind became very significant. The grind for endgame weapons, which really before was tied to events and the availability of Twinkling Sand to create core weapons, it dramatically changed, and having those High Dragon weapons was a very significant power upgrade. I think one of the first big power upgrades, not tied to the gacha, but tied to the gacha in the sense that if you had access to better dragons, it was a lot easier to clear content. If you had better characters, it was easier to clear content and hence farm those weapons which all players had access to. We're almost at the end here with this clear on Primal Midgardsormr. Like I said, the length of the fight is longer as well. That High Midgardsormr's Trial, whether in solo or co-op, it only lasted 5 minutes. This Primal Midgardsormr's Trial, you have 10 minutes to take it on in solo and 8 minutes in co-op. I wanted to see if I could get the solo clear in time with the co-op clear time limit, and I was able to do so with 3 minutes left, so a little bit less than a 7-minute clear. In the end, the HP and the mechanics of solo and co-op are different nowadays too, so that's one last difference I'll mention. But that is pretty much going to do it for today, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this tour down memory lane. It was very fun to record this. Thank you as always for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.